I want to start with a thought experiment. Imagine that your community of 20 people is starving and you've been given a 2 kilo bag of rice. So, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be quite so drastic. I don't want to traumatize anybody here, but just imagine you have to figure out what to do with your 20 kilos, 2 kilos, sorry. And so you decide to divide your rice evenly among your 20 people, 100 grams each. This is essentially what a budget is, right? Here's your big bag of rice. You're going to divide it up this way. I mean, there's infinite ways that you can divide up a bag of rice. You're deciding to go evenly, 100 grams for everybody. But in reality, we all know that 100 grams of rice is not enough to feed a person, not even for one day. So what can you do? You need something different. So this is where we think, well, if I actually need to feed people properly, I'm going to need 3 of those bags of rice for one day. I'm going to need 5 kilos of veggies, and I'm going to need at least 20 eggs, right? So this is what we call costing, where we think about what we actually need and what resources we need in order to do the things that we want to do. Maybe it's to survive as researchers, maybe it's to produce a project or an outcome. So now we can approach our funders. We can say to our first funder, great, we're so happy that you've given us the rice, keep giving us the rice. The price for them is their original 1 bag of rice. That's what we're going to charge them as our 1 bag of rice. No change. But maybe we find a second funder who can give us some more rice and the vegetables, right? So we've got another price to a different funder. What we need hasn't changed, but where our resources are coming from might be more diversified. And for our third funder, maybe we're going to be a bit more creative. Our price will be different. Our price this time, it's not eggs. We know we need eggs, but really we want to be sustainable. We're going to get ourselves some chickens from the third funder. The reason I've said that is because when we're thinking about costing and pricing research, we're always talking about budgets. What is our budget? What is our budget? But actually, at a pre-award stage, before you've got the money, you're not budgeting, you're costing and pricing. You need to be thinking about how much your research costs, and you need to be thinking about how much does your funder need to pay to be able to make your research be sustainable as possible. You also need to be aware that in most cases, this is not for profit. You can't just say, well, I want you to give me more than I need. You need to demonstrate value for money. This is the chickens. Chickens in the long run are going to be cheaper than continuing to provide eggs. So when I'm talking to people about budgeting, I like to emphasize this difference between cost versus price versus budget. You might come across this term FEC, or full economic cost. That means the total cost of your project, including any hidden costs that might not be charged to the funder at all, costs that your university might absorb, for example. So that first tip, 2 kilos of rice, let's just imagine as an analogy that that's the indirect cost that your institution is going to cover. You don't necessarily charge that to the next funder because that's already covered. The price that you put in your budget, in your application, that's the amount of money you're asking for. It might not be exactly the same as the cost. Quite often it's a little bit less. And the budget, well, that's for later. Budgeting is how you're going to spend the money after you've had it awarded. And oftentimes you might need to negotiate how much your budget will actually end up being versus what you asked for. I think many people here have probably had the experience requesting a grant with a certain amount of money and being awarded the grant, but with a smaller budget. The way you do your costing is that it must be generated by your research activities. This means that you need to think about what kind of things are you going to be doing, when are you going to be doing it, who's doing it, what resources are people going to need to do the thing, And how long is it going to take? How long are you going to need the money for? Also, every organization I've ever worked at has had the same rule, which is that you must, as someone who's requesting funding, try to recover as much of that full economic cost, as much of the full cost of research as possible. Your institution doesn't want to lose money in supporting you if there's a funder that can pay. Most funders are going to be paying you, and it's easy to think about the direct costs of research. That's the things that you pay for that are quite tangible, that you can definitely say, this is a thing that this project needs to pay for. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, what those might be. So here's an easy one: equipment. If you need equipment, that's an easy direct cost. It's not always allowed. Lots of funders will say you can't request equipment. But if they do, and Wellcome is a great funder that often allows you to request equipment, sometimes you might need co-funding, but if you do get the opportunity to request equipment, remember, include the maintenance fees and include depreciation if you're allowed to include depreciation. Here's another one: IT. Do you need computers? You probably do. Do you need bits and pieces to go with the computer, like your mouse? Do you need software? Don't forget about that. And data. How are you going to manage the data for the IT stuff? That means you might need a data management plan as well. So you can see that thinking about the kinds of things that you need, or the kind of activities that you're going to do, will help you to build your budget and figure out how much it's going to cost. Similarly, for consumables, there are some that are obvious and easy, like your lab supplies, chemicals. Others that people tend to forget are things like PPE, like the printing cost for your participant consent forms, for example. Is anyone going anywhere to do this work? So thinking about the activities, any field work, are there going to be meetings? A lot of funders are requiring that we're quite careful about carbon footprint these days. Do you really need to fly? Do you really need to travel? What can you do online? And don't forget those other little bits and pieces of cost, because they do add up, like per diems and like having to get a taxi at the new city when you're traveling. There might be costs that you also want to consider to include in your budget, like, does your project need a logo of its own? Do you need your own website? Do you need to do social media to generate participants, for example? And if you do, who's going to manage it? How will you present at conferences if you haven't got travel budget, if you haven't got all those kinds of things in your communication budget? Another thing that's quite important nowadays is there's often a requirement that you make your publications available open access. So can you include publication costs? And if not, how are you going to publish? If you're doing clinical research, I think quite a lot of people here today are, there are very specialized costs, like the cost for drugs, like the cost for hospital fees. There might be ethics approvals. There might need to do lengthy informed consents, which means that you need to pay staff a bit more. You may have thought about patient compensation, but that also means that you have to compensate patients' families and their caregivers for their time as well. Compensating doctors and nurses who maybe work for the hospital but not directly for you. These are additional clinical types of costs that must be included. And finally, never forget to pay your salaries for your staff. This is usually the biggest component of a budget. Staffing costs, you might have consultants. Perhaps you can add administration staff or specialized research support staff as a direct cost to your budget. And you probably do need to add some time for yourself if it's allowable, and your institution is likely to force you to. Additionally, in your budget needs to have indirect costs. This is all the stuff that your university or your institution needs to pay for, but can't say that it's only incurred specifically because of your project. So that might mean things like security, like audits, like insurance, like the cleaning stuff, like the maintenance guy. It might mean bank fees. It might mean some kinds of taxes. All of these things that are a little bit nebulous. You must consult with your university about what those costs are and whether and how to calculate with them. Like, don't assume that you are going to be able to request the entire budget envelope and use all of it to pay for your direct costs. Usually some of that budget envelope is going to have to go to your institution to help pay their running costs, and you want it to. Because when you invest in the running costs by investing in by allowing your university to claim indirect costs, then you have a better chance of getting more support in your institution, and you're developing the capacity for your institution to do research and to support you in the future. Just some final thoughts. If you have collaborators, make sure you've read the rules quite carefully around what your collaborators can claim and what they can't, particularly if you have put together a research team that comes from different parts of the world. So for example, sometimes high-income countries are not really allowed to claim costs for themselves, only for collaborators from low-income countries, for example. And remember that if you have, your institution can have indirect costs, your collaborator's institution will also have indirect costs, and they might be different rates, but whatever they put in their budget, they should be allowed to keep from the awarded budget. Another thing to consider if you're putting together a bigger project with international collaborations is collaborators in different countries. There might be real currency concerns, so you need to make sure that you're using a sensible exchange rate. My recommendation is something like the average exchange over the previous 12 months if you don't have an institutional rate already for that currency. You also need to be able to show that your collaborators have agreed their budget. I quite often see, even to this day, people hoping to say, well, I'll just put 50,000 aside for that collaborator. And that is not quite an equitable collaboration. You need to be sure that your collaborator has agreed that that budget is going to be appropriate for them. Because if they come back later and say, but I can't do it with the money you've given me, then your project is going to hit a real difficulty. But when you're working with collaborators, it can be hard to get them to do stuff on time, right? So you need to have clear instructions, and you need to sort of address your own leadership as well. Make sure that your collaborators know what's expected of them, follow up, give them good timelines, make sure they provide you with justification as well as the costs that they're requesting, and they provide you with all the documentation that you need. Finally, I just want to talk very quickly about justifying your budget. You will know that you may have seen, that you are often asked to provide a budget justification, not just the numbers, but also the explanation of why you need that justification. There's a lot to this, and obviously it's something that we could talk about to a lot of detail, and we don't have a ton of time, but the justification means that you explain why you've requested that money. Explain what you need, how you're going to use it, and why it's important. If it's something really expensive, like that fancy microscope we saw before, maybe you need a quote as well, or several quotes to show that this is a good value for money request that you've got. And as I said before, sometimes your funder comes back and says, no, I can't give you all the money you want, but I do want to fund your budget. I do want to fund your project. The reality is we can't just cut the budget. We can't submit an inflated budget that's not the real budget. And we can't just cut the budget and still deliver everything, because we're generally working on this not-for-profit basis. So my advice for researchers is, if they're going to cut the price, then you have to reduce the scope. That means that actually when you're putting together your application and your proposal, you're not putting together one, you need to put together at least two. The expensive gold class, absolute best research project you can imagine. And that if I had to do it for cheaper, I could do this instead, project and still deliver good results. The worst case scenario is you accept a reduced budget and then you spend time completing a project but don't deliver good results. So you have to only accept a budget cut if you can deliver good results that are going to get you publications that you can use to further your career. So I want to say good luck. You've got this. There are lots of experts here and lots of people in the audience who have been through it before. Pop your questions in the chat and we will try to deal with them.